True crime cases often involve heartbreaking emotional stories that can really make you question the sanity of some of these criminals. But some cases are far more shocking and disturbing than others. And today we will be covering one of the most brutal true crime stories ever told. Gary Simpler boarded the ship the Spoilsport from where he and his wife would dive into the Great Pacific Ocean and see the wreckage of a ship that sank in 1911. As the couple made their way down, they took lots of pictures. Once they reached the wreckage, Gary's wife posed and her picture was taken. But little did they know that this very picture would go viral sometime later. But for a very eerie reason. After taking the photo, Gary saw something weird in the distance. It was another diver. But what's weird about another diver being in the background? Well, the diver is too still, motionless, lying face up on the ocean floor. At first, Gary thought that the diver was doing it for attention or to freak other people out. But then minutes passed and still no movement. That was when Gary saw yet another diver, and it was a man. He seemed to be making his way towards the motionless diver on the sea floor. He waited for the fellow diver to pull the other one up to the surface, but that didn't happen. The second diver let the first one go and descended to the surface on his own. What Gary didn't know was that the motionless and deathly still diver, a wife, and a newlywed wife at that, she was on her honeymoon. And the diver who had just abandoned her was her husband at 11 days. The grueling, confusing, and equally tragic case of Tina Watson is the story of a honeymoon gone wrong. Would a husband really go to the depths of the ocean to take his wife's life? What would compel him to do this surrounded by other divers? Well, there's a lot more to this case than meets the eye. Welcome to True Misdeed Stories. If you're new here, I post new crime documentaries every single week. So, if you're interested in simple, classic true crime without a bunch of hoopla, then you've come to the right place. While you're here, consider hitting that subscribe button. It's completely free and it just keeps you up to date with all my future videos. Christina May, better known as Tina, was born on February 13th of 1977 in West Germany. When Tina was still a baby, her biological parents placed her for adoption. So, she spent the first few years of her life in an orphanage in Germany. 3 years later, in January of 1980, Tina was legally adopted by Tommy and Cindy Thomas, who were both from the US. And together, the family of 3 lived in Walker County, Alabama. The Thomas family did move a couple of times, first to Louisiana and then to Birmingham, Alabama, where they then permanently settled down. Tina was very close to her family. They were loving, caring, and an overall great family. Cindy Tommy described Tina as a bright, pleasant, and happy girl. She loved animals, and she was just a sweet, wonderful person to be around. Unfortunately, when Tina was young, she was diagnosed with PSVT. It's basically a heart condition similar to arrhythmia. It wasn't life-threatening or anything, but it definitely took a toll on her. After graduating high school, Tina attended the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And during this time, she was engaged to a man named Scott. But around the same time though, someone else caught the sight of Tina. And that person instantly became infatuated with her. And this person was Gabe Watson. David Gabriel Watson, who went by his middle name of Gabe, was described by friends and family as a fun, easygoing guy who got along with everyone. Now, when Tina and Gabe crossed paths at the University of Alabama, it was love at first sight for Gabe. He was completely blindsided by what he felt for Tina. So blindsided that he kept asking her out, even though Tina was still engaged to Scott at that time, and Gabe knew that. Obviously, Tina didn't reciprocate Gabe's feelings because she was in a committed relationship with somebody else. But that didn't seem to bother or deter Gabe because he was relentless in his pursuit of asking Tina out. During this time, Tina's relationship with Scott had turned sour. Sources say that Tina's mom disapproved of the relationship, and this ultimately led to Tina breaking off the engagement with Scott. So, now Tina was a single woman. And when she went out with her friends to a New Year's Eve party, she bumped into, you guessed it, Gabe Watson. And for him, it felt like nothing had changed. Once again, Gabe asked Tina out. And this time, she said yes. And the couple started dating in January of 2001. After graduating from the University of Alabama, Tina worked as a manager at a clothing store, whereas Gabe worked as a salesman for his father's packaging business. Now, one thing about Gabe was that he loved scuba diving. It was his hobby of sorts, his passion. Gabe was also a certified rescue diver with lake experience at the Oak Mountain State Park. And he basically coerced Tina to take scuba diving lessons, which she did even though she wasn't super interested. Now, Tina had that heart condition, and even though she'd gotten a minor surgery for it at the age of 24, her parents were still very skeptical of her when she started scuba diving lessons. But soon enough, Tina, after safely completing her training, earned her certification just before October of 2003. By late 2003, Gabe and Tina had been dating for 3 years. But something about Gabe just rubbed Tina's parents the wrong way. This was why when Gabe asked Tommy for Tina's hand in marriage, her dad was pretty apprehensive. Tommy and Cindy thought that Gabe only thought about himself. He didn't consider Tina or her well-being. And there was a serious lack of communication in their relationship. So, in the end, Tommy didn't give Gabe permission to marry Tina. Now, Gabe and Tina didn't need her father's permission, but Gabe thought that it would be polite to ask anyway. But despite not getting her father's approval, well, fast forward to April 20th of 2003, Gabe proposed to Tina and she accepted. To say that Tina's parents were shocked is an understatement. But Tina was an adult. It's not like they could do anything to stop her. If she wanted to marry Gabe, then she could. But there was more frowning from Tina's parents because 5 months into the engagement, Tina went to visit her family and she had an odd request to make. Tina asked her dad to increase her life insurance and then make Gabe the sole beneficiary. Now, this was not what Tommy was expecting. So he said that they would go over it after the wedding and honeymoon and that she didn't have to worry about it right now since the couple were already busy with the wedding planning. October 11th of 2003 was the big day when Tina Thomas officially became Tina Watson. The couple was over the moon and Gabe had planned the perfect honeymoon trip for him and his new wife. It was a scuba diving excursion. This wasn't really what Tina had in mind, but Gabe really wanted to go to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, so she agreed. Now, to put things into perspective, Gabe had successfully dove 55 times, whereas Tina only completed 5 dives, and those weren't even in an ocean. When you're out in the middle of nothing, diving can be a very different beast. Gabe wanted to see the underwater wreckage of the SS Yongawa, which sank in 1911. This wreck was located about 98 foot down or 30 m. down on the seafloor. Tina had no ocean experience, and the deepest she'd ever been up to this point was just 9 m. So, this dive was going to be almost 4 times deeper than what she was used to. Regardless, the couple decided to pack their bags and head to Australia. Now, honeymoons are intended to be small little adventures you can look back on years down the road. But for Tina, this trip would mark the final moments that she was seen alive. Tina and Gabe packed their bags for a 2-week trip to Australia. Their first stop was Sydney, where they'd spend a week exploring. The next week, they travelled to Townsville, Queensland, where they boarded a ship named Spoilsport, which would be their diving boat to the ship's wreckage. Now, this dive wasn't for beginners. The waters weren't unexpected. The wreckage was deep down, and before divers could take the plunge, they were offered to go through an orientation as well as a guided dive with an expert. Well, Tina and Gabe refused this. Apparently, the couple were confident that they'd be perfectly safe. Gabe was an experienced rescue diver after all. He had everything figured out and everything would be under control. Before diving, Gabe asked for additional weight on Tina's vest because in his expert opinion, she wouldn't be able to descend completely if she wasn't weighted. They got the weights, everything was smooth, and the couple dove right in. But within minutes, only Gabe would resurface, and he wouldn't have Tina with him. It was around 10:30 a.m. on October 22nd, 2003. And according to Gabe, as soon as they descended, he noticed a worried look on Tina's face. She was flailing her arm around, and in the process, she knocked Gabe's air regulator and mask off. After Gabe fixed his gear, he noticed Tina sinking to the ocean floor, motionless. According to Gabe, the current was far too strong for him to go in any deeper and rescue Tina, and it was easier for him to resurface and ask for help from the ship. Keep in mind that these are the words of a certified rescue diver. Saving a sinking Tina was literally his job, but he claims he couldn't do it. But in Gabe's defense, and wait for it, because it's insane, He said that he never learned how to get somebody who's in trouble to the surface during the entirety of his training. Well, by now 10 minutes passed since Gabe resurfaced back on the spoilsport, and it was actually the diving instructor, Wade, who dove back in and pulled an unconscious Tina back to the surface. Wade pulled Tina and himself onto another diving boat called the Jazz 2. By the time Tina was hoisted into the boat, things were not looking good. She was completely motionless. Luckily, a doctor was on the boat and he rushed over to Tina's aid and he attempted CPR, but it wasn't working. He tried for an incredible 40 minutes to bring Tina back, but it was no use. Tina was gone. Everyone was so confused. What had even happened? Tina was fine 1 minute, then the next she was flailing and begging for help, and then the next it was over. Tina had lost her life underwater on her honeymoon just days after marrying the love of her life. After the catastrophe, Gabe was wrecked, according to witnesses, but not in the ways you might expect. Various witnesses reported seeing him huddled up in a corner of the boat sobbing, but no tears were coming out. He was then seen asking various members of the crew and other divers for hugs, but he never once made any attempt to actually try and save his wife, nor did he even approach her after she'd been brought aboard by the dive instructor. He just left her there in the hands of two strangers. Soon after, an autopsy was performed by Professor David Williams, and he found that there was a little bit of water in Tina's lungs. For her to pass away by drowning, she should have had a lot of water in her lungs. But now, with drowning ruled out, there wasn't any indication about what her cause of death actually was. The autopsy stated that there was evidence of air embolisms, which are large air bubbles in vessels, veins, or arteries inside your body. But regardless, Tina's death was ruled a drowning, as there simply wasn't any better explanation. Wade, the diving instructor, also found something weird. Tina was unusually heavy when he brought her back to the surface. He had to remove excess weights that Gabe had requested for an easier descent in order to bring her up quickly. Wade found that Tina had over 20 pounds of weight on her vest when she only needed 10. If you thought that was weird, well, people had seen some weird stuff underwater, too. One witness named Stanley Stutz, who was also diving at the same time as Tina and Gabe, noticed Gabe giving Tina a bear hug underwater. Now, some might think that this was just the two of them getting close, but Stanley literally could see Tina struggling. She was flailing her arms, and as soon as Gabe let go, Tina sank to the ocean floor, and Gabe effortlessly swam back up to the surface, seemingly without a care in the world. Another diver named Gary, who we mentioned at the beginning of this video, had an underwater camera with him, and he was photographing his wife when he caught something in the background, and it was the diver who was face up motionless on the ocean floor. An accident to murder. The police talked to witnesses and noticed a lot of loopholes and inconsistencies in Gab's more ever-changing version of events, but they also looked at both Tina's and Gab's dive computers. Now, dive computers will show the time of the dive, the depth, and how many times a person resurfaces and then dives back in. Well, according to Gabe, he said that he got to the surface at the speed of light to get help for Tina. But his dive computer said something else entirely. It showed that Gabe was ascending really slowly, as if to buy more time. The police thought that this was suspicious, and they were right. Tina's dive computer confirmed that she was an inexperienced diver and that she wasn't ready for the dive at all, which is just heartbreaking. But what about the water in her lungs? Well, experts believe that Gabe purposefully turned Tina's air off, quite possibly during that bear hog, and when he knew that she was unconscious, he turned it back on. And as Tina sank to the ocean floor, her mouth relaxed, and that was how a little bit of water managed to get into her lungs. This was later argued in court by other scuba divers who thought that even if Tina's air had run out, she would have been able to resurface. But you have to remember she was inexperienced and she'd been given too many weights. She'd never been so deep before either. So maybe she panicked. Maybe she just didn't know what to do. Again, this is all an assumption because in reality, Gabe and Tina are the only two people who knew what happened. And Gabe, as you might have already guessed, is not so reliable. The training company where Gabe got his certification also confirmed that Gabe had only ever done 15 ocean dives, and he boasted about how experienced he was when he really wasn't. So, for all we know, Gabe must have been about as experienced as any beginner or maybe moderately intermediate diver. While talking to the police, Tina's dad, Tommy, also pointed out something weird. He said that the flowers he left on Tina's grave would always mysteriously disappear. Loved ones would have to chain flowers down to Tina's grave so that they wouldn't be stolen. The police thought that this was weird, too, and they actually installed a camera near Tina's resting place. But what they found out didn't actually surprise them because they were already suspicious of one person. The camera showed that none other than Gabe was stealing all of the flowers and notes left by Tina's loved ones from the grave and then loading them into black trash bags. When the police confronted Gabe about this, he said that he was respecting Tina because she didn't like big gaudy plastic arrangements. Later on, for some reason, likely because he just likes to mess with Tina's loved ones. In 2007, Gabe exhumed Tina's body from her original resting place and moved her to a plot that was under his own name. And get this, he left her grave unmarked for 2 years after this. A footmarker was eventually placed on Tina's grave at her dad's request in 2009. But even then, Gabe wasn't done with his tantrums. See, Tommy wanted Tina's belongings back as a way to remember his daughter. But Gabe flat out refused. It ended up taking a court order just to get Gabe to stop stealing things off of Tina's grave. But the worst was yet to come. So, with all of this information and Gabe's very questionable behavior, the Australian authorities flew to Alabama and they found even more alarming details about Gabe and Tina's relationship. First of all, they found out that Gabe relentlessly pursued Tina in college, even though she was clearly taken. And when he got her, he wasn't the charming and romantic guy that everyone thought he was. Tina and Gabe's relationship was on and off again. The couple would argue a lot, and Gabe even threw pizzas at Tina during one of their heated arguments. Gabe was also extremely jealous, and if Tina ever went out with someone else while they were broken up, he would torment and harass Tina until she had no choice but to just get back together with him to get him off her back. All of this information was slowly coming to light, and police now had ample reason to suspect that Gabe most likely had a hand in his wife's death. Catch. They filed all the appropriate paperwork with the police, and eventually Gabe was extradited to Australia to stand trial for the murder of his wife. But there was a catch. He was charged with murder at first. But Gabe made a deal to only go back to Australia if the authorities dropped the charges from murder to manslaughter. In the end, Gabe was found guilty and he was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison, but he only served 18 months before his release. The US authorities then wanted to try Gabe in Alabama with new evidence. This appeal was granted on the condition that Gabe wouldn't be sentenced to death if he was found guilty of murdering his wife. So after Gabe served his 18-month sentence in Australia, he went back to the US where he was arrested and the trial was held on February 13th of 2012. But in the trial, the prosecution wasn't allowed to bring up Gabe's behavior or even the life insurance claim. Now, we don't know why these pieces of evidence couldn't be brought up in court. But this really hurt the prosecution's case. At this point, since most of the evidence couldn't be used against Gabe, the judge acquitted him of the charges because the evidence was sorely lacking. So, Gabe was allowed to walk free. Soon after, he married a woman named Kim, and now he lives in Hoover, Alabama, and the house that he inherited from Tina following her death. This man literally murdered his wife, inherited her house, then moved into it with his new wife. You can't make this stuff up. The main problem with this case is that there's just no answer to one question. Why? Why did Gabe do this? Tiana was one of the nicest people around, and from all reports, she did nothing but try to love him the best she could. But Gabe was just a selfish man who couldn't have cared less about his wife. And let's not forget, Tina wasn't even interested in diving in the first place. She learned to dive just for Gabe. She agreed to go on a honeymoon she wasn't excited about. All for Gabe. Even after all this, he still took her life for reasons we'll never know, unless it was just for the money. In the end, Tina's family just wants answers. Through a court order, they were finally able to forbid Gabe from ever visiting Tina's grave again. But this does little to atone for the fact that Tina ended up in that grave in the first place. This man outright murdered his wife in front of multiple witnesses. The police know that he did it and they can prove it, but somehow he managed to only spend 1.5 years behind bars. My heart aches for Tina's family because at this point they're forced to live with the fact that their daughter's killer, who never really was trusted in the first place, will never face the consequences of his actions. He's been allowed to move on and just keep living his life while their daughter's life was needlessly cut short. And for what reason?